Mr. D'Souza is a great American patriot who loves this country very dearly, and so it's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you this evening Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, this is great. I'm excited to be here, accompanied by my wife, Debbie. Debbie, say hi. We're actually newlyweds. If you've seen the movie Hillary's America, how many of you have seen the movie, by the way? Wow, this is great. No wonder Trump pulled it off. Well, Debbie sings the song "God Bless America" in the movie. And by the way, if you're doing a family celebration about the election this week, it's a good idea to download that song on iTunes and listen to it. It's very inspirational. I also want to acknowledge a very special guest in the audience. This is Rafael Cruz, Pastor Cruz. Are you here, Rafael? Can you raise your hand and say hi? Actually, Pastor Cruz married us in San Diego in March. And I think when he heard we were here, he thought he would check up on us and make sure that we were relating to each other in a cordial way. So, now, thanks to the Young America's Foundation for having me. This is actually a very historic moment. And I don't say that lightly because one can speak in a cavalier way about history being made. But today is actually an historic day. It's an historic day for the country, which is a much bigger deal than an historic day for any of us individually. It was a historic day for me in 1978 when at the age of 17 I left my home country of India and arrived on the shore of America. That was an important day for me. In some ways that was my July 4th, my Independence Day, if you will, because I kind of knew, without having thought about politics at all, I kind of knew I was leaving the margin of the world and coming to the center. I knew I was coming to a country where if I stayed, I would be able to be the architect of my own destiny. America is a country where we are in the driver's seat of our own life, where your destiny isn't given to you so much as constructed by you. So I knew even then intuitively that my life was going to be different from that moment on. But while that was an important moment for me, it wasn't an important moment in general. This is an important moment in general, not just because we've had an election, not because of the broad rhetoric about the country being at stake and us losing America forever. It's really that we're seeing a tectonic shift in American politics. American politics is a one-party system. And what I mean by that is that for all of American history, we have typically had one dominant political party and an opposition party that essentially keeps the majority party in check. Ever since the founding of the Democratic Party by Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, the Democratic Party was the majority party for about 40 years. Until the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Republican Party, the new Republican Party, which had just won the election of 1860, became the majority party from 1865 until 1932, all the way to the New Deal. This is not to say that if you're the majority party, the other side can't win. It can win, but if it wins, it's going to be carried by your tide. And so the Republican Party was the majority party for 40 years, and then the Democratic Party resumed its position as the majority party starting in the New Deal, 1932, until 1980. The Democratic Party dominated American politics. It almost always had the presidency, it almost always had the Congress, and the Republicans were a kind of somewhat limp-wristed and pathetic Me Too party, trying to check and moderate the Democrats, but unable to offer any winning agenda of their own. Now, between 1980 and now, American politics has been anomalous in that it has been divided. We have had essentially divided government in which neither side had a kind of clear majority. Even in the Reagan era, Reagan for the most part had the presidency, but he never had the Supreme Court and he never had the Congress. He briefly had the Senate, but not both houses of Congress. Now, Reagan was powerful enough that he was able to get legislation through, even with a Democratic Congress, but nevertheless, in the entire Reagan era and the subsequent Bush era, now Clinton is a very good example of a Democrat pulled by the Reagan tide. I'm talking here about Bill Clinton. And then we've entered the age of Obama, and Obama's dominated American politics at the presidential level for 8 years. But notice that in the midterm elections, Republicans won strong victories, thus checking Obama. And so ever since Obamacare, in the very beginning of Obama's first term, Obama has not been able to get any significant legislation through. And the Supreme Court has been precariously balanced pretty much in the middle. It should be a Republican court because the majority of the nominees are Republicans. But the Democrats are much more assiduous in making sure that their nominees conform to sort of democratic orthodoxy with Euclidean certitude. Republicans pick all these guys and we don't seem to know where they're coming from, so it's kind of like, uh-oh, let's keep our fingers crossed and see what happens with Anthony Kennedy. Oh, wow, we got Kennedy. Whoops, we lost Roberts. So the court has been this kind of migratory bird, and the net effect of this is that American politics has been in limbo. No dominant party. And the Democrats this time around were really salivating, because they realized that if Hillary wins decisively, that her coattails would carry the Senate. And if she got the Senate, in effect, she'd get the Supreme Court. Because remember, Supreme Court nominees are confirmed by the Senate. The House has nothing to do with it. So for Hillary, this would represent a kind of clear path that even Obama has never had. And this Hillary path would be uninhibited by the normal checks and balances of American politics. Remember, American politics is deliberately constructed to make it kind of difficult to get things done. And so, even if you're the president and you go, wow, I want to do this, the truth of it is you need the House and you need the Senate. You actually need both. And even if you have the House and Senate, you still have to contend with the Supreme Court. And even if you have all the branches of government, you typically have to contend with a very watchful media, a so-called fourth estate, whose job it is to keep a watchful eye on everything you're doing. Well, well, well. The beauty for Hillary is that she knew that taking down these guardrails of American politics was actually going to be relatively easy. Let's start with the media. The remarkable thing about the media is that in other countries where you have powerful rulers who want to bring the media to heel, you've got to go into the editorial offices, throw over their desks, beat them up, threaten to lock them up. Ironically, with none of this, Hillary basically has this kind of lapdog media. And by lapdog media, I mean, I'm not talking about the obvious fact that, gee, you know, we all have unconscious biases and we can't help them seeping into the way we write. I'm talking about people egregiously violating basic journalistic ethics. Pretty much the only investigative journalism we've been seeing in America in the last year has come from WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is basically... WikiLeaks is our new deep throat. And, but if it wasn't for WikiLeaks, people say, well, WikiLeaks is in league with the Russians and so on. Look, I would much rather get all this investigative stuff from the New York Times and CBS News. But I can assure you that if the New York Times reporter was the only guy standing present when Hillary fell headlong into that van, that article would never have appeared in the New York Times the next day. These are people feeding articles to the Hillary campaign to edit. These are people colluding with the Hillary campaign, basically saying things like, give us questions to embarrass Trump. These are people who are feeding debate questions in advance. So this whole election cycle, even before yesterday, there was already one big loser, the credibility of the mainstream press. And because I think even to the outside guy who's not that political, you could basically see the media huffing and puffing to drag this crooked hag across the finish line. They were trying to do that. Now, most people don't realize this because they live in a fog. And if you think about American politics, it's very difficult because most people in this country don't pay attention to politics. Maybe most of us in this room do, but we're abnormal. It's kind of like when my daughter was 8 years old, and I'd sometimes be with a group of her friends, or we'd be riding in the car, and they'd be listening to some extremely weird music. And I would realize that for a few moments, I would sort of parachute into that planet of, you may call it tween weirdness, and I would sort of pay attention for a few seconds and then happily tune them out for the rest of my life. And that's how most Americans see politics. They parachute into it very briefly around election time, and then they go on to their normal lives. And most people don't get information directly. You get it through the filter of the media. So the media plays a critical role. That is part of what makes what happened yesterday so startling. Because on Hillary's side, you had a terrifying array of forces. Forces so formidable that to any normal person it would seem impossible that anyone could have beaten her. You had not just the media. You have the media, Hollywood, and academia. So these are the three biggest megaphones of our culture. And the strength of them is that they ricochet on each other. They refract each other's messages. Some guy at the Harvard Law School in academia puts out a theory. And then that's picked up by the media. And then Steven Spielberg makes a movie about it. And then that movie is then critically assessed by Jon Stewart and Bill Maher, the comedians, who are then echoing. So you basically have a reverberating message. And for a lot of young people, that's where they get their messages. Young people go, well, I watched Colbert, I watched Jon Stewart, I watched that Oliver guy. And who's on the other side? Nobody, nobody, and nobody. So, and then, not only do you have this bizarre, mercurial character, Trump, but he's got a full 1/3 of his own party against him. So, apart from Hillary's massive lead in resources, this is worth commenting on because historically the Republican Party has been the party of successful people. It's been the party of the rich guys. And as people became rich in America, they would generally vote Republican. There was almost no exception to this rule. My former colleague Irving Kristol used to say that Jews are the only people in America who earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. But only them. Every other group, as you accumulate some dough, you basically defect to the Republican Party, but not now. Now the Democratic Party raises more money than the Republican Party. A typical CEO or high-tech mogul is more likely to be Democratic than to be Republican. So this is all the inbuilt advantages of Hillary. And here's Trump, this outsider, who walks into American politics like a bull in a china shop, seemingly have no idea how it's done, not only somewhat unprepared, but not even apparently seeing the need to prepare. Somebody with an ability to throw an unbelievable knockout punch, but his own supporters always fearing that this knockout punch might knock him out. So this is our candidate. And as you know, the stalwarts of the Republican Party don't show up at the convention. Some of them publicly announced they're not for Trump. So we now come to the remarkable question, which I'm going to answer in a moment. What really happened? I mean, how did Trump pull this off? You could literally see the dazed expression on the faces of, well, we watched CNN. So, you know, I mean, poor Wolf Blitzer's face just got increasingly constipated as the evening went on. You know, John King was in a virtual daze. I think even this morning he was searching for, you know, phantom votes that Hillary might be able to eke out in Michigan or Pennsylvania. So this is really a pretty remarkable sight. These are the experts. And behind them is a formidable army of academics and pollsters. This is the best intelligence we have in the country. By the way, it's kind of the same intelligence that caused us to invade Iraq. But nevertheless, this is where we started out, and this is where we ended up. Now, I do want to say, as an immigrant, as an outsider, I don't think the ordinary American realizes what a close call this election was yesterday, and to what degree a whole view of America and a whole view of the American dream kind of hung in the balance. And I want to start by talking about that for a moment, because what we've been seeing in American politics in the last few years, to me very troubling, is an increasing gangsterism that America was supposed to be free from. Now, this gangsterism is, I should emphasize, quite normal in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, it's quite normal to find your political opponents assassinated, people mysteriously being thrown off a roof, people being prosecuted on bogus charges. We've seen this in Russia, where Putin's done this with his opponents. This kind of stuff goes on in Debbie's home country, Venezuela. It goes on in my home country, India. If you've seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Gangsters run the slums, they run politics, people go into government to make money, and this is normal. But think of how abnormal it is in America. Number one, we've had rich guys who have been president before, but in almost every case they were rich beforehand. JFK was rich, but he didn't get rich off the presidency. FDR was rich, but he was rich before. Now, contrast this, for example, with Bill and Hillary Clinton. They not only came to office broke, but Hillary says they left the White House broke. She's somewhat exaggerating because she had a $6 million contract in the wings, but she is right that they had all these legal bills. Now, the legal bills admittedly were due to their own actions. Bill Clinton had to fork over $800,000 to Paula Jones for exposing himself. They had whitewater legal bills for attempted shenanigans that went back to their Arkansas days. But nevertheless, yes, they were technically broke. And yet, these guys, between the year 2000 and let's say now, went from $0 to $200 million they never started a business. They didn't invent the iPhone. So the question becomes, how do you pull this off? I mean, Donald Trump, whatever you say about that guy, he built a bunch of buildings. He did real estate development, so that's his product, buildings. What is the product that the Clintons were selling that enabled them to become centimillionaires in such a short order? Well, the dismaying answer to that, well, I suppose if you ask Hillary, she'd say, well, of course, the product we were selling is, my husband is a really good speaker, and he gives some really memorable speeches. Now, that answer contains a grain of truth. But it is worth noting that Bill Clinton's speaking fee, which was $150,000 for many years, pretty much along the lines of any ex-president, mysteriously quadrupled the exact moment that Hillary became Secretary of State. It went from $150,000 to between $500,000 and $750,000 to give a single speech. So obviously this wasn't a speech. The donor, which is sometimes not even American, we're not even talking about just Goldman Sachs, we're talking about the government of Qatar, or the government of Morocco, or some Canadian billionaire who wants to buy uranium rights in Kazakhstan, or a bunch of Indian billionaires who want Hillary to switch the US government's position on the Indian nuclear deal. They invite Bill to speak. But this is not the bribe. This is only a down payment. Because then Hillary does the deed, she switches America's position on the nuclear deal, and then tens of millions of dollars flow to the Clinton Foundation. So that's step one, the speech, step two, the deed, and step three, the subsequent payment. And I could give you 10 examples off the top of my head of this three-part sequence. The Clintons even admit it. They admit part one, they admit part two, they admit part three. Their defense is that part 1 and 3 has nothing to do with 2. We took the money, we did the deed, we took more money, but the taking of the money had nothing to do with the swapping of the policy. Now, this has been going on in a very scandalous way in American politics. It was happening even when Bill was in the White House. I mean, if we think back to the last days of the Clinton White House, at that point, the Clinton presidency had kind of broken down. You couldn't do a whole lot on public policy. So the Clintons were doing 3 things simultaneously at breakneck speed. Number 1, renting out the Lincoln bedroom for cash. Number 2, walking through the White House with aides, essentially looting the place. Taking curios out of the cabinets, taking Norman Rockwell paintings off the wall, packing them up, sending them off to Chappaqua. The Secret Service had to drive down there and bring some of that stuff back. And number 3, selling pardons for money. So if you were a big-time racketeer, tax cheat, or felon, you simply had to tell them how much you were willing to pay to get your criminal conviction overturned. This, unfortunately, was before my time, because otherwise I had to put in my own bid to get my own campaign finance law overturned. So, now look. My worry going into this election was simply this. We have had corruption in American politics before, but not at this level. Typically, it's local. I mean, you have Tammany Hall in New York, the Daily Racket in Chicago, but we've never had a Secretary of State even accused of renting American foreign policy to the highest bidder. And now, I could go on with this, but people say, well, gee, but, what about Trump? What about Trump? Well, I think in politics we always make a distinction between the private man and the public official. So it could very well be that you did all this bad stuff in your private life and you said all these horrible things 10 years ago on a bus and you did this and you did that. But those are not violations against the public trust or the public treasury. The important point is that the Clintons have been standing as custodians of our money and, in terms of policy, our honor. And that should not actually be up for sale. Now, on top of this, as I researched the movie, Hillary's America, and the book, I realized that there's a whole untold story about the Democratic Party that needs to be told. Why? Because A, it's never been admitted, and B, not only does it depart from the official story of the Democratic Party, it is the direct opposite of what the Democrats say about themselves. So the Democrats say we're the party of the ordinary guy. We're the party of the little guy. We fight for women. We fight for Latinos. We're the party of minorities. Who do you think did the civil rights movement? We did. Now, this self-description of the Democratic Party is a huge lie. The Democratic Party is the deadly enemy of the common man. It has been the lethal enemy of blacks. It has been the oppressor of Latinos and other immigrants. It has been the thwarter of women's suffrage and women's rights. Far from doing the Civil Rights Act and movement of the 1960s, the Democrats were actually the opposition to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And if there were no Republicans around, if the Democrats were the only party in the House and the Senate, none of those laws would have passed. Not the Civil Rights Act of '64, not the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not the Fair Housing Bill of 1968, none of it. The Democratic Party is actually the party that threw the American Indians off their land and did the infamous Trail of Tears. The Democratic Party for 50 years was the upholder and defender of slavery, and defended it not only in the South, but also in the North. Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, was the public defender of slavery in the North. And after slavery, the Democrats became the party of white supremacy, of segregation. Every single Southern segregation law, without exception, was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials, sheriffs, and so on. The Democratic Party is the founder and reviver of the Ku Klux Klan. Virtually every Klan leader for 100 years is a Democrat. Virtually every one of the thousands of blacks and white Republicans lynched by the Klan was lynched by a Democrat. This is the actual history of this party. Democrats opposed women's suffrage for 30 years. They tried to block it in the Congress, where they lost, and then they tried to block it in the states, where they lost again. Now, like I say, it's one thing to do bad stuff in the past. All we ask today is that if you did that, and if your party is responsible, admit it, acknowledge it, take responsibility for it, apologize for it, and perhaps pay a few pennies of restitution because we live with the present effects of past injustices. The Democrats have never done this. Never. So, then you come to the question of if that's true, Dinesh, if what you say is true. And by the way, in the movie, I make all kinds of statements, almost off the cuff, that have taken audiences by surprise. I say, for example, in the movie that in 1860, the year of the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. All the slaves in the United States, and by the way, we're talking about 4 million slaves, were owned by Democrats. Now, this is what you call fighting words, because it's a scientific claim that is eminently refutable. All you have to do is give me a list of 5 Republicans who own slaves, and I'll have to take it back. But no one has been able to do that because there aren't any. So the point I'm trying to make is, how does a party that has been implicated in the most vicious crimes of American history avoid having to admit it? How do you fool the public like this? How do you fool smart young people in a university setting? Well, the answer is you do it by shifting the blame onto someone else. And so in slavery, the Democrats, after the Civil War, shifted the blame onto the South. They made it seem like the slavery debate was between the anti-slavery North and the pro-slavery South. But that's not true. Most Southerners didn't own slaves. Most Confederates didn't own slaves. As I mentioned, the Northern Democratic Party was as determinedly pro-slavery as the Southern Democrats. So the real slavery debate was between the anti-slavery Republicans and the pro-slavery Democrats. But after the war, the Democrats rewrote the history books to put the full blame on the South, where it rests squarely today. So what the Democrats do is, for all this stuff, from segregation to lynching, they go, we blame the South. We blame the white man. We blame America. America did this. America did that. America interned the Japanese Americans very unjustly after World War II, or during World War II. America? No, America didn't do it. If America did all this stuff, it would still be going on. Obviously, some Americans did it, and other Americans stopped them. So who interned the Japanese Americans in World War II? FDR. So my point is that what we need to try to place responsibility not on some generic America, but on the actual bad guys who did actual bad stuff. And that's what we do in the movie, and the effect of it has been dramatic. I say dramatic to this degree. I mentioned earlier the media. Do you realize, so here's Hillary's America, the #1 political film of this year, in the top 10 political documentaries of all time. It's pretty cool. We've sort of left poor Michael Moore in the dust on this. Yeah. Because he's been sort of the king of the genre. But today, poor Michael Moore, he made a movie on Trump. Couldn't even put it in the theaters. So he got it in one theater in New York. But even then, he didn't even sell tickets. It was free. So you just line up and walk in to see the movie. Now, the point I want to make about all this is simply this, that the Democrats have managed to camouflage their history, and when it's pointed out, I pivoted my own career from being a writer and speaker to being a documentary filmmaker because I wanted to have a megaphone to contradict the megaphones on the other side. But you'll notice that this movie, Hillary's America, if you've been only watching ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR, you would not know that this movie exists. It's never been mentioned. Why? What kind of journalism is it that doesn't take the most discussed and the highest grossing political film of the year? It's about the election, and they don't even mention it. The reason is they're actually terrified of it. They can't refute it, and so they deploy all these critics. It's the most boring film of all time. It's not easy to make the most boring film of all time. I'd like to sometime try, but if you go on Rotten Tomatoes, the critical site, very interesting. Our film gets 3% from the critics and 85% from the audience. The actual ticket-buying audience. I've never seen so dramatic a spread between critical reviews, obviously designed to bury the film, and actual viewers who really like it. Now, this is a little bit of our history. And part of what I'm saying is that for me, Hillary's America represents a more gangsterized America. Much more than Obama. Obama's an ideologue at the end of the day, and whether you agree with him or not, he has an ideological vision of America and the world. The Clintons are really more like Bonnie and Clyde. These guys, if you've read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, they're like the Duke and the Dauphin, two scam artists making their way through the South, running cons and scams on gullible people. And the Clintons have prospered doing this, and they've had huge collaboration. I mean, the big difference between me and Hillary is I don't have the FBI in my back pocket. I don't meet with, Loretta Lynch on the tarmac. One of the things I discovered when I was in enforced confinement, and by the way, I think I've never abstained from admitting that I exceeded the campaign finance law. I did break the law. But justice is also a matter of, does the penalty fit the crime? The other guys who did the same thing get the same penalty. It turns out that no American has ever been locked up for doing what I did. In a case involving $20,000, remember, you can go to an Obama fundraiser and write a $25,000 check straight out. So there are 20 legal ways to give. No one in giving 20 grand in a case not involving corruption. I gave the money to a college friend of mine who was running for the Senate. It was the first time I contributed a political contribution, and I never even told her about it. So there was no question of me trying to buy an appointment or get something out of it. That was never even alleged. Now, but when I was in confinement, a lot of these convicts, and it was actually quite amusing because they'd ask me what I did, and I would try to explain. But what they would say is, you know what? Most of us in here were the small fry. All of us did drug smuggling, cocaine, petty trafficking, this and that. So we're locked up, but you notice that the big fry are out there. They never get locked up. And the system doesn't even go after them. Why? Because they're too well connected in it. And now, given what I know about American politics and given what we see, and our film, by the way, came before all these WikiLeaks revelations. And these WikiLeaks revelations are just a sort of startling confirmation, pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, let me return to the question I raised earlier. If we've narrowly dodged a bullet, if we've narrowly dodged the Hillary's America specter, if this is a nightmare not made but prevented, how did that actually occur? How did this unlikely fellow Trump? I mean, even Reagan. Now, by the way, people did say a lot of the same things about Reagan. He's a cowboy. He's insane. He's gonna blow up the world. But nevertheless, Reagan had been governor of California for 2 terms. Reagan did have a history in politics, which Trump doesn't. Trump, by the way, is the first president to come out of nowhere to the White House since Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was the supreme commander of World War II. So how do you do this? I think the answer to it is twofold. The first, the substantive reason, is that Trump figured out a deep Achilles heel in the Democratic coalition, and the Achilles heel is the white working class. Now, the funny thing about the white working class is that every time you traipse across campuses in the country, you meet professors of sociology and Romance languages who profess to be champions of the working class. But this working class that they champion is purely theoretical. They've never actually met a working class guy. And so this working class exists in their imagination. It exists in the works of, Karl Marx's manuscripts. Now, the Republicans have been courting this working class, which was in the 80s called the Reagan Democrats, with, I would say, only limited success. Why? Because the Republicans always tried to win the working class on social issues. So the Republicans realized that this white working class is predominantly Christian, it's gun-owning, it's socially conservative. These are people who are not very happy with abortion. They like law and order. And so the Republicans would appeal to these social values and hope that these social values would override the economic considerations of the working class, which would incline them to vote for the Democrats. And so it was kind of a toss-up. Which is more important to you? Your social values on the one hand, or your pocketbook on the other? The genius of Trump is that his strategy was, I'm going to go after the working class on both sides of the aisle. I'm going to appeal to their values. You can't have a nation without borders. You can't have a society without law and order. Go back to the original liberal theorists. Why do we have a social compact? Why do we have a country? Why do we even have a government? Reason number 1, to protect us from foreign and domestic thugs. That's the first reason. The government has to do that first. It can then do 4 other things. But if it's not doing those things, the other things are unimportant. And so Trump appealed to those values. But at the same time, he pulled out a magic bullet, and that magic bullet is trade. Now, this is exactly what has earned Trump the enmity of many people in the so-called Republican establishment. They hate this. Why? Because they've all been reading way too much Milton Friedman. Free trade. Free trade is good. Free trade is wonderful. Yeah, free trade is wonderful. But nothing in an economics textbook is wonderful if it doesn't hit the ground in a wonderful way. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have free trade. Obviously, the logic of free trade is really simple. If you have something to sell and I have something to buy and nobody's forcing us to do it, we wouldn't do it if we weren't each better off. I would never give $2.50 to Ralph's or Safeway and take a carton of milk if, to me, that milk wasn't worth at least $2.50, because no one's forcing me to do it. So trade is in that sense inherently beneficial across the aisle. But now I give you a second scenario, which is that the Japanese come to America and sell cars without tariffs. But every time we go to Japan, they put a $4,000 tariff on our cars. So it's a level playing field over here, but no level playing field over there. Now, what does the Milton Friedmanite have to say about that? Well, the Milton Friedmanite says, that's not ideal, but it's still better to have free trade over here than to try to put tariffs, because that's only going to cause a tariff war. But see, this is Milton Friedman, a very good economist, stepping into an arena where he actually knows nothing, which is the arena of political and human psychology. The area of political psychology is you go to the Japanese and say, listen, you want free trade, we want free trade. But it's a two-way street, pal. And so if you have $4,000 tariffs on our cars, we're going to put $4,000 tariffs on your cars until you take those tariffs down. Then we will take ours down, and we will have a level playing field across the board. Now, this may seem like a violation of economic principle, but it is no more a violation than during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln, upon learning that the Confederates were executing free blacks. Every time a free black was captured from the North, the Confederates shot him. They wouldn't shoot white prisoners who would be put into prison camps, but they would shoot the black guys. And so Lincoln said, okay, as long as the Confederates are doing that, every time we get word of one free northern black executed in the Confederacy, we will execute one Confederate soldier until they stop. Again, is Lincoln a barbarian? No, this is a war. And on war, certain rules of humanity and justice have to be observed on both sides. So the point I'm trying to make is that Trump, without probably having read Milton Friedman, I don't even know if he's heard of the guy, but he doesn't have to, because he kind of knows that countries aggressively pursue their interest. And he kind of knows that when every other country is doing that, it's kind of his job as the president to do that here too. This is what he calls America First. And I have to admit that this America First is a little bit of to me as an immigrant, it kind of rubs me the wrong way. I mean, I'm a patriot, but I never call myself a nationalist. America First kind of jars me a little bit. But I must say, it jars me in part because for 8 years we've been living under the exact opposite. Obama is kind of an America Last guy. And what I mean by that is, we expect as Americans, in a democracy, we elect people to do stuff for us. That's why we vote for people, to protect us, to fight for us. And the weirdest thing about Obama is it never seems like he's even interested in attempting that. To him, he's never inside America fighting for America and looking out at America's enemies. He seems to be outside America, looking in. To him, America appears to be some kind of, petulant child making absurd and exaggerated demands, and Obama is sort of the temperate, overlord, kind of taming America down. No, America, you're misbehaving again. I'm not going to be giving that to you. So, since we've been having this sort of almost obstinate defiance of protecting America's interests, Trump is sort of the anti-Obama. And so what's at stake here, this is why Obama campaigned so hard. It's not that Obama loves Hillary. The Clintons actually have been openly racist about Obama. They went to see Ted Kennedy in 2008, and Bill Clinton made the statement, with reporters present. He goes, a few years ago, this dude would be getting us coffee. He's talking about Obama. Obama knows about all this. You may not know, but he knows. He doesn't like them. But he also knows that his legacy is at stake. He needs to pass the baton to somebody who's going to keep doing the stuff he did. And that's why Obama very truthfully said, basically, if you like my legacy, you got to vote for Hillary, because I'm turning the baton over to her. So this election was in part, a referendum on Obama. And to my way of thinking, a very valuable referendum, because the American people have given that guy the thumbs down. Now, Wow, I've been kind of carried away, and I've just completed the introduction to my speech. As you can see, I'm really getting into it. No, I want to pivot here because I want to leave time for questions. And so I want to talk at least briefly about the road ahead. Not just how Trump won, but what are the implications of this? Well, the implications of this is that now, for the first time, the Republicans have the possibility, as the Democrats would have had they won the election, of having three branches of government coordinated on one side, which is to say a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican presidency, and a Republican court. Now, this is not going to happen overnight. First of all, there's a Scalia vacancy. This fellow who's been nominated, Merrick, whatever his name is. It's amazing how memories are so short. I can't even remember the guy's name. His candidacy is doomed, because obviously we'll have a Trump nominee. But if the Trump nominee, even if the Trump nominee is a conservative, he just replaces another conservative. So there's no alteration in the balance of the court. It remains kind of a 50-50 proposition. But if Trump gets another nominee, that then becomes a 5-4 majority tilting to the right. So the Republicans, for the first time now, can't be just the sort of party of no. They can't just be the party of why Obama and Hillary are bad. They actually have to be the party of what do we do now? And I'll just say a word about this before turning the floor open to questions. Foreign policy. It seems to me a very prudent American foreign policy would cut a middle ground between the kind of Obama allergy to American involvements abroad and the Bush overenthusiasm for deploying troops. There's a middle position that Reagan defended that he called the Reagan Doctrine. And the Reagan Doctrine is very simple. We do not fight for other people's freedom. No. They fight. We help. And so when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan with 100,000 troops, Reagan didn't send 100,000 troops to go get killed fighting them. He told the Afghans, you mobilize Muslims from all over the Muslim world. You fight. But if they send the helicopters to shoot you out of the sky, we'll give you Stinger rockets to be able to fire back. The United States would supply materials, but not men, to counter Soviet influence. So this seems to me to be a workable middle ground in dealing, because what it essentially says is, it says to the Kurds, it says to people in the Middle East, people in Iran say, oh, we're ready to launch a revolution to overthrow the mullahs. We want America to send 50,000 troops to help us. No. You want to have a revolution against the mullahs? You lead the revolution against the mullahs. You come to us and give us a laundry list of how we can help you achieve that. And remember, for the first time, we're even talking about who are our friends, who are our enemies. The bizarre thing of the past 8 years, no one's even been keeping track. And when you don't keep track, you happen to notice that many of your allies are disappearing one by one, and your enemies are getting stronger. Mubarak was our ally in Egypt, he's gone. Gaddafi wasn't an ally, but he was doing business with us, he's gone. The mullahs in Iran are our enemy. Not only are they very much in power, they seem stronger and more well consolidated than ever. This is the Obama legacy. And it's not my opinion, this is actually what's been happening over the past 8 years. A word about the economy. Trump, I think, is a capitalist. He is a champion of the free market. It's obviously worked very well for him. But I think he modifies that in the sense of thinking about an economy as an economy that must benefit people. It's not like there's this organism called the economy and we have to support that. Rubbish. The economy is a mechanism for creating wealth, and this wealth does need to be somewhat broadly distributed, which is to say, we need to have an economy that's working for everybody. Why would some guys participate in an economy that's only working for other guys? I mean, the extreme example of that is slavery, right? Slavery is theft of another guy's labor. You work for me for free. Well, why would I do that if you weren't forcing me? So we need to have an American economy that's not obsessed with the issue of inequality, because inequalities are inherent to technological capitalism, but we need to have an economy that does work for the middle class and for the working class. And I think Trump is attentive to that, and politically that's a very good thing. You want to have a president who is looking out to make sure that the broad swath of Americans are benefiting from economic success. And third, Trump simply recognizes that in a country you need basic law and order, and you do need a border. Now, nobody can deny the legitimacy of these things who has a fence around their house. Nobody can deny the legitimacy of these things who says, my property ends over here, and you can't drive your car onto my lawn. Obama recognizes the need for a border. He recognizes the need for a wall. He goes beyond a wall. He has a highly militarized fence that surrounds his own abode with highly armed people ordered to shoot if anybody bridges that fence. That's how he lives. So how can you say that a country doesn't have that? Now, people say, well, this violates our values, this violates our traditions. No, our tradition is one of encouraging immigrants, but legal immigrants, and immigrants who assimilate to the American way of life, and immigrants who actually help us. Why on earth would any club open its membership to anyone other than the people that they want to join the club? This is not a violation of liberalism, it's the very essence of liberalism. If you have a social compact, it's between us, in which we make a bond for self-protection, and we make a bond to pay taxes, and we give up our natural right to self-protection, and if 10 other guys want to come in and join this group, they need our say-so to do it. So we have become so crazy on this issue that we can't even talk sense about it. And so Trump appears strident, and maybe at times he is strident. But the truth of it is there is a basic common sense to what he's saying. And I think the test of it will be what he actually does. What he actually does. Many people are very nervous at this point in American history. I am a little, but I'm also excited. To me, you had two doors in this election. The Trump door, because he's an outsider, has a whole bunch of question marks. And the Hillary door bore a simple, unobtrusive sign, a known crook. And so, pretty unhesitatingly, I have strolled through the Trump door. Why? Because in politics, we have actual choices before us. We have flawed candidates, don't get me wrong. These are not, in a sense, my choices, but they are the choices before me and before us. And so maturity demands that you look at that and you make that choice and you recognize their implications. You can't stop Hillary and the Democrats if you don't vote for Trump and the Republicans. You decide, I'm going to stay home, and maybe you hurt Trump, but you hurt Republicans all the way down the ballot, and you lose the Senate, you lose the House, and you're standing on principle in such a way that the effect of what you're doing is the suicide of your own principles. This is pure madness. So, I think this has been a moment of real reflection and even maturity on American politics. Clearly, there are rifts and divides, the elites versus the ordinary guy, the college-educated, sophisticated class against the blue-collar working class. I mean, it's a real irony of American politics that right now, the Republicans are the party of the working class. And the Democrats are the party of the upper class. And I don't just mean upper in terms of money, but money and education and sophistication and technology and number of non-fat lattes consumed in a week. And on it goes. So, here we are. Our future is undetermined. But that's the nature of being an American. And I, for one, am very hopeful. And I hope that we'll have reason to look back on this moment in history and say, we're glad we did what we did, America. Thank you very much.